April 18, 1943. 2 hours out over the Solomon Sea, 50 feet above the water, 16 American fighters flew in complete radio silence toward a point on the map that existed only in the mind of the man leading them. Major John Mitchell had no radar, no beacon, no landmark. He had a compass, an airspeed indicator, a clock taped to his instrument panel, and a heading he had worked out on the ground the night before. If his arithmetic was wrong by a few degrees or a few minutes, the most important interception of the Pacific War would find nothing but empty sky. At 9:34 in the morning, 1 minute ahead of the time he had written down, a pilot broke the silence with 2 words. Bogies, 11 o'clock. High and to the right, descending through the haze, were 2 Japanese bombers and their fighter escort. Aboard the lead bomber sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor. The Americans had flown 400 miles to keep an appointment the Admiral did not know he had. This is the aircraft that got them there, and the few minutes over Bougainville that ended him. To understand why this mission needed the Lightning, and no other airplane, you have to start with the target. Isoroku Yamamoto was the most important officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and he understood American industry better than almost anyone in Tokyo. He had warned his own government that a long war against the United States could not be won. Then he planned the attack that started it. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the strike he had designed sank or crippled much of the American battle line at Pearl Harbor. To the American public, no enemy name carried more weight. Killing him would not win the war by itself. It would, though, remove the one Japanese commander the Americans genuinely feared, and it would tell Tokyo that nowhere was safe. The opportunity came from a broken code. American cryptographers had been reading the Japanese naval cipher, known as JN-25, for months. On April 14, 1943, they decrypted a message that laid out Yamamoto's travel plans in detail. The Admiral would tour his forward bases in the Solomons on the 18th. The message gave the airfields, the aircraft, the escort, and the times down to the minute. Yamamoto was known throughout the fleet for his punctuality, and his own staff had just handed the Americans a schedule. There was one obstacle. Yamamoto's route ran along Bougainville, more than 400 miles from the nearest American airfield on Guadalcanal. Almost no fighter in the theater could fly that far, arrive with fuel to fight, and come home again. The one that could was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The Lightning did not look like any other fighter of the war. Instead of a single fuselage, it had 2 long booms running back from the wing, each ending in a tail, with a small central pod between them that held the pilot and the guns. The shape came from its engines. Where most fighters had one, the P-38 had 2 Allison V-12s, liquid-cooled and turbo-supercharged, each turning its own propeller. The 2 propellers spun in opposite directions, which canceled out the twisting force that made powerful single-engine fighters want to swing on takeoff. A pilot could push both throttles forward and the airplane tracked straight down the runway. Each engine produced around 1,100 horsepower in combat, and the turbo-superchargers were the heart of the design. They forced compressed air into the engines high up, so the Lightning kept its power at altitudes where thinner air robbed other aircraft of theirs. Could climb past 38,000 feet and run to just over 400 miles an hour. 2 engines also meant a pilot could lose one over hundreds of miles of ocean and still come home on the other, which mattered more than anything on a mission like this one. Then there were the guns. On most fighters, the weapons sat out in the wings, angled inward so their fire crossed at a single distance ahead of the plane. The Lightning carried all of its guns in the nose, grouped tight around the cockpit. 1 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns fired straight ahead in a single parallel stream. There was no convergence point to judge and no wing flex to throw the aim off. Where the pilot pointed the nose, 5 guns struck together, and they kept striking at ranges where wing guns had already spread their fire apart. It was, in effect, a flying gun platform with the legs of a bomber. The Lightning was also large for a fighter, with a wingspan of 52 feet, closer to a light bomber than to the small single-seat machines around it. That size bought fuel. With external tanks slung under the wings, the P-38 could reach targets no single-engine fighter could touch, and it was this reach, even more than its speed or its guns, that put it on the flight line for a mission to Bougainville. The Germans in Europe would call it the fork-tailed devil. In the Pacific, the two highest-scoring American aces of the entire war, Richard Bong with 40 victories and Thomas Maguire with 38, both made their names in the Lightning. If you appreciate aviation history told with the real numbers and the real names, a subscribe and the bell keep the channel climbing. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, gave his approval on April 17th, after consulting Admiral Halsey down in the Solomons. The job went to the 339th Fighter Squadron on Guadalcanal, and the planning fell to a 29-year-old named John Mitchell. Mitchell's problem was not the fighting. It was the flying. To slip past Japanese radar and the coast watchers on the islands, the Lightnings would have to stay under 50 feet the whole way out, so low that spray from the swells streaked their canopies. They would fly a long dogleg well out to sea, closer to 600 miles than the direct 400, to come at Bougainville from the empty ocean side where no one would be looking. There could be no radio and no navigation aid of any kind, because a single stray transmission would warn the Japanese and throw the whole mission away. So Mitchell did it with a clock and a compass. He worked out 4 separate compass headings and the exact number of minutes to hold each one, correcting for the wind, and he had a special marine compass fitted to his instrument panel. To carry the fuel, ground crews hung a pair of drop tanks under each Lightning, including big 330-gallon tanks brought up specially for the trip, so the fighters could burn the external fuel on the way out and keep their internal tanks full for the fight and the run home. 18 aircraft were assigned, for were named as the kill flight, the ones who would climb to make the actual attack. The rest would stay high as top cover against the fighters everyone expected around the Admiral. On the morning of the 18th, 2 Lightnings dropped out before they had properly begun. One burst a tire on takeoff. Another could not draw fuel from its tanks. 16 flew on. For the next 2 hours they held formation just above the water. No one speaking, Mitchell watching his clock and his compass and nothing else, betting the outcome of the mission on numbers he had written down the night before. At 9:34, Mitchell reached the point where his arithmetic said Yamamoto should be, and he was a full minute early. High and to the right, a pilot named Doug Canning caught the glint of the formation and called it in. 2 Betty bombers coming down toward the airfield with 60 fighters stacked above them. Yamamoto, exactly on time, had flown straight into the one patch of sky where 16 Americans were waiting. The Lightnings dropped their tanks and began to climb. The plan gave the attack to the 4-plane kill flight, but 2 of them ran into trouble at once. Besby Holmes could not release his drop tanks, and he and his wingmen turned out to sea to shake them loose, which left just 2 pilots to make the intercept, Captain Thomas Lanfear and Lieutenant Rex Barber. The Zeros saw the danger and dove to cover their admiral. Lanfear hauled up into them, climbing head-on to pull the escort away, while Barber bored in on the bombers alone. Barber came down behind the lead Betty as it dropped for the treetops. He opened up with the cannon and the 50s together, and the concentrated fire walked across the bomber's right engine and along the fuselage. The left engine caught and streamed heavy black smoke. The Betty rolled hard to the left, so far and so fast that Barber had to bank sharply to keep its wing from striking his own aircraft, and it went down into the jungle below. Holmes and Barber then ran the second bomber out over the coast and hit that one as well, and it came down in the water. Above them, the dozen top-cover Lightnings turned to keep the rest of the Zeros off, and for a few violent minutes the air over the coast was full of diving fighters. It ended almost as fast as it began. With both bombers down and their fuel running low, the Americans broke away and ran for home the way they had come, low and fast over the water, some of them chased out to sea by the surviving Zeros. Barber flew back through the middle of the fight the whole way. When he landed, the ground crew counted around 104 bullet holes in his Lightning. Every American came home except one. Lieutenant Raymond Hine was last seen trailing smoke over the water, and he never returned. For decades afterward, Lanfear and Barber each claimed the bomber that carried Yamamoto, and the Army split the official credit between them. When Japanese search parties reached the crash site, and later when historians studied the wreck, the damage told a plainer story. The rounds had entered the bomber from directly behind, from the position Barber had flown. They did not match the deflection angle Lanfear had described. The judgment of Air Force historians today is that the burst that killed Yamamoto came from Rex Barber's guns. A Japanese search party reached the crash site in the Bougainville jungle the next day. They found Yamamoto still strapped in his seat, thrown clear of the broken aircraft and sitting upright beneath a tree, one white-gloved hand resting on his sword. The autopsy recorded 2 bullet wounds, one through the left shoulder and one through the jaw. Everyone aboard his bomber had died. On the second Betty, which came down in the sea, the Admiral's Chief of Staff, Mato Magaki, survived the crash with 2 other men. The Americans said nothing. The whole mission rested on the secret that the United States was reading the Japanese Naval Code, and to boast about killing Yamamoto would have told Tokyo exactly how the Americans had found him. The pilots were ordered to keep quiet about how they had known where to be. In London, Winston Churchill's government worried the secret might slip out. For weeks, Japan itself would not admit what had happened. Only on May 21 did Tokyo announce that Admiral Yamamoto had met his death in the air, in combat with the enemy, and on June 5 the nation held a state funeral through the streets of the capital. The full truth that his death had been an ambush built on a broken cipher stayed buried until after the war was over. For Japan, there was no replacing him. Yamamoto was both the Navy's sharpest strategist and its most public face, the one commander whose name the ordinary Japanese citizen knew. His successor did not carry the same weight, and the officers who had served under him understood that the war had reached a stage where even the commander of the combined fleet could be picked out of the sky by name and hour. Operation Vengeance was the longest fighter interception flown in the entire war, and it worked because of 2 things that owed nothing to luck. It worked because codebreakers had read an itinerary off a message meant for no one but the enemy. And it worked because one particular airplane could fly 400 miles over open ocean, fight at the end of it, and carry its pilots home again. No other fighter in the theater could have done all 3. The P-38 would go on to serve in every theater of the war, to carry the 2 top American aces to their records, and to fly reconnaissance so deep behind the lines that its cameras mapped the ground for the invasion still to come. The mission marked something new as well. For the first time, a nation had used its codebreakers to reach hundreds of miles across open water and kill one specific man out of an entire war, by pointing 16 fighters at a single spot in the sky at a single minute of a single morning. Half a century later, veterans from both sides would meet and shake hands, and argue quietly over whose guns had fired the fatal burst. High over Bougainville, on the morning of April 18, 1943, the argument had lasted only a few seconds. Rex Barber banked hard to miss a falling wing, looked down, and watched a column of black smoke climb out of the jungle where the man who planned Pearl Harbor had come to Earth.